This video is brought to you by Mubi, a curated streaming service showing exceptional films from around the world. Get a whole month free at mubi.com/eyebrowcinema. I've celebrated the virtues of my local indie theater on this channel before, but the good people of the Screening Room really spoiled me last May when they hosted a series covering Francis Ford Coppola movies in the 70s to celebrate The Godfather's 50th anniversary. The Godfather and The Godfather Part II collectively make up what might just be my favorite movie of all time, and the chance to finally see them on the big screen was pure magic. But as I yet again experienced the agony and the ecstasy of the Corleone family crime saga, a stray thought wormed its way into my brain. Maybe it's time to revisit Part 3. Unlike the first two movies, which I've watched over and over again since first seeing them as a teenager, I'd only seen The Godfather Part III once, 6 years ago. My response was not enthusiastic. By that point, I had already put Godfathers 1 and 2 on a pedestal that the divisive end of the trilogy never had a chance of achieving. Anything short of a sublime masterpiece meant utter failure. In hindsight, it's clear to me that my rejection of Part 3 was largely driven by a fanboyish attachment to the first two movies, and an inability to see past them. Part 3's positive elements lost in an entitled sense of the film not being the Godfather sequel I wanted. Coppola himself could have been in the room feeding me cannolis, and I still would have been like, no Tom Hagen? Pfft, 2 stars. A second chance was clearly owed, and I was all the more curious given Coppola had in fact recut The Godfather Part III in 2020 to coincide with the film's 30th anniversary. Retitled The Godfather Coda, The Death of Michael Corleone, this version was said to be closer to Coppola's original intent and vision for the end of Michael's story. And that seemed the perfect means to return to The Godfather Part III with fresh eyes, less bound by fanboy expectations, and more willing to meet the movie on its own terms. Who knows? Maybe I'd even learn to love it.
In musical terms, a coda is sort of like an epilogue. It's a summing up, and that's what we intended the movie to be.
What exactly is The Godfather Coda? Well, it might be more informative to state what it isn't, which is to say, it's not Blade Runner. This isn't a case where post-production problems and studio meddling hobbled a movie's greatness on initial release, with subsequent re-edits fixing imposed problems and revealing just how great an achievement the film truly is. This isn't an Apocalypse Now situation either, where reels of previously cut footage have been inserted back into the movie to create entirely new scenes that had never been seen before. And frankly, it's not a Snyder Cut situation, where the director's version is so far removed from the theatrical release that they may as well be two different movies. Instead, The Death of Michael Corleone is a work of modest tinkering rather than profound transformation. Scenes have been rearranged and repurposed, but nothing new has been added. A few extraneous pieces have been cut, but nothing so substantial as to make for an entirely different experience. The movie on the whole has been changed from what audiences saw back in 1990, but it's still very recognizably The Godfather Part III. With that in mind, let's talk about what specifically has been changed, starting with the title. Francis Ford Coppola has long maintained that he always wanted to call this movie The Death of Michael Corleone, and that was even the title on he and Mario Puzo's original screenplay. Coppola believed that the Godfather story really ended with Part 2, and thought of the third movie as more of an epilogue than a continuation. Calling the film The Godfather Part III, as Paramount insisted on doing, conjured expectations of another grand sequel that the movie wasn't actually aspiring to. Restoring the original title reaffirms the idea of the film as epilogue rather than continuation. The film's opening has also been completely restructured. Gone is the papal order induction ceremony in honor of Michael, the desolate shots of the abandoned Corleone compound in Nevada, and the flashback to Fredo's assassination. Instead, the film begins with Michael and the head of the Vatican Bank meeting to discuss a business partnership, a scene which originally occurred near the end of Act 1 in the theatrical cut. Coda then dissolves to a truncated version of Michael writing a letter to his now adult children, inviting them to join a family celebration at his home in New York, which leads directly to the reception where Vatican business partners bump shoulders with Michael's gangster past. From here, the film plays out pretty close to the theatrical cut, with Michael's efforts at legitimate business dealings being undermined by gang warfare, Sonny's bastard son Vincent's ascendancy in the Corleone crime family, and the complex inner workings of the Vatican power struggle, with all story threads culminating at an opera in Sicily. Some scenes have been trimmed, and a few excised entirely. Notably, Connie and Alneri giving Vincent the go-ahead to assassinate Joey Zaza, Donald DeBello trying to convince Michael to retire in the hospital, and the flashbacks to Michael dancing with Apollonia and Kay after Mary has been shot have all been cut. As the film comes to a close, Coda makes its most substantial deviation. Where Godfather III originally ended by jumping ahead many years to an elderly Michael dying of natural causes, Coda re-edits the scene to omit his death, leaving Michael alive, but alone, rendered hollow by a lifetime of sins. Added text repurposes the Sicilian expression of cent'anni to mean something more sinister than celebratory, underlining the tragedy of Michael's long life. So overall, what's different? Well, not much, but I do think the small changes Coppola has made mostly constitute an improvement. Best of all is the reorganized opening scene. Moving Michael and Archbishop Gilday's meeting to the beginning not only establishes the Vatican plotline that will run through the story much earlier than in the theatrical cut, it also more firmly establishes the film's defining narrative throughline. That finally, the Corleone family is an arm's reach away from legitimacy.
We've sold the casinos. All businesses having to do with gambling. We have no interests or investment in anything illegitimate.
What's at stake for Michael is much clearer from the start, and that makes this iconic line at the end of Act 1,
Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in.
all the more resonant. This opening also allows the third movie to stand on its own 2 feet in a way the theatrical cut does not. Much as I love these atmospheric shots of the abandoned Nevada compound, their presence also brings the ponderous weight of The Godfather Part II to bear, all but ensuring the third movie opens in the shadow of arguably the greatest sequel ever made. To that end, omitting the Fredo flashback is also a wise choice. Fredo's death is such a charged emotional climax that including it in the beginning doesn't give Part 3 any room to go. Coda leaves it as a memory, Fredo's presence stronger precisely because he isn't seen, but his name whispered in hushed, solemn tones, or in desperate, anguished cries. This omission also places greater poignancy on Michael's confession as the strongest evocation of Fredo's death.
I ordered the death of my brother. He injured me. I killed my mother's son. I killed my father's son.
The emphasis in this cut is less on remembering what has happened, but stewing in how that memory has echoed through time since. The trims and cuts to Part 3's middle section are not as dramatic as the restructuring of the opening, but they are beneficial, streamlining the film's pacing. Cutting the church scene between Al, Connie, and Vincent makes Joey Zaza's assassination at the street festival a more thrilling surprise, and even complements the scene construction, which is all about misdirection. Withholding this information also more closely aligns the audience's perspective with Michael's. We're in the dark about Vincent's plans, and they surprise us just as they do Michael. Cutting the hospital meeting also makes Don Altobello's villainous machinations less overt, while the removal of Kay and Apollonia from the flashbacks roots the tragedy of the climax more specifically in Mary's murder, rather than some all-encompassing reflection of Michael's life. The only change that isn't successful is also the biggest one: the ending. Conceptually, it makes sense. The death of Michael Corleone is not literal, but spiritual, with a lifetime of sin and bloodshed, rendering him a hollowed-out shell, metaphorically killing whatever humanity he once possessed. Closing out the Godfather saga with Michael alive, but tortured by the monster he's become, sounds like a great ending, and in truth, it was. When The Godfather Part II did it. Having destroyed his family, Michael sits alone and quietly reflects on his life. For Coda to essentially repeat that ending emphasizes how little Part 3 actually does to advance Michael's story, and it makes the whole movie seem a little bit pointless. Moreover, the personal tragedy at the heart of Coda's ending is less closely tied to Michael's sins than it is to the villains acting against him. An assassin is out to kill Michael, and in the chaos of the act, a wayward bullet kills Mary instead.
Dad?
It's sad, and Michael's harrowing scream certainly communicates profound loss. But he isn't really responsible. Yes, if Michael wasn't a mob boss, then his daughter wouldn't have been in harm's way, but it's a very indirect connection. Especially since, in this case, Michael is only being targeted because Altobello wants in on Michael's legitimate business with the Vatican. The culprit isn't Michael's sin, but Altobello's greed. Compare this to Part 2, where Michael very consciously chooses to have Fredo killed, and does so despite knowing his brother is no longer a threat. One end is an expression of a character's failure, and reflective of the choices that person makes. The other is a result of plot machinations and a bad guy doing a bad thing. That's not to say the original ending of Part 3 is better exactly. Having Michael die a lonely old man is an interesting enough idea, but giving the audience all of 5 seconds to accept Al Pacino in fairly lousy old age makeup before he keels over and dies has always felt awkward. Still, it at least provided a definitive end to the story. Coda's ending leaves both the character and the series as a whole in a strange limbo, one that closes the movie on a slightly unfulfilling note. In his commentary track for the theatrical cut, Coppola talks about how he long agonized over how the movie should end, and if his tinkering in Coda is indicative of anything, it's that he still hasn't licked it.
Maybe I could help.
You're out, Tom.
Earlier, I joked about my fanboy rage over Tom Hagen being written out of the story, but if I'm being honest, it still bothers me a lot. Tom's notable absence is the result of money disputes. Coppola claims Robert Duvall wanted a salary more comparable to what Pacino was getting, while Duvall clarified, "I would work easily if they paid Pacino twice what they paid me. That's fine, but not 3 or 4 times, which is what they did." With Duvall gone, Coppola rewrote the screenplay to explain that Tom died at some point between Godfathers 2 and 3, and his role as lawyer to the Corleone family has been replaced by a new character named B.J. Harrison. Now, this sort of amendment is not unprecedented in the Godfather series. A very similar issue occurred on The Godfather Part II with Richard Castellano, resulting in Clemenza dying off screen and being replaced by new character Frank Pantangeli. So why was that okay and this isn't? Well, for one, Pantangeli proved a unique character in his own right, a force of personality brought to life vividly by Michael V. Gazzo. BJ, on the other hand, has no discernible personality and is barely even a character, only relevant when the script needs someone to do some lawyering. But on a deeper level, Clemenza was no Tom Hagen. Don't get me wrong, I love the guy and remember his scenes fondly, but he's a secondary character at most, and isn't an essential part of the story. Replacing him with someone else perhaps isn't ideal, but it isn't unfathomable either. Tom, on the other hand, is irreplaceable, a cornerstone of the Corleone family and business, and Michael's most trusted confidant. By the end of Part 2, He's arguably the second most important character left in the story. How do you try and proceed without him, especially with a third movie so concerned with the fallout of Michael's choices? How might Tom's relationship with his son contrasted with Michael's? One small but essential aspect of The Godfather Part III is Michael's understated disappointment in his children. All he ever wanted was supposedly to protect his family. And what were the end results? A son ashamed of his father's business, and a daughter in an incestuous love affair with her cousin. It used to bother me that a sleazy hothead like Vincent was the heir apparent to the Corleone Empire, but in hindsight, it's thematically appropriate. That he isn't really worthy of being Godfather is precisely the point Michael forced to settle with a disappointing new generation. But in the background of this is Tom's son, Andrew, now an ordained priest who even gets a prestigious post in the Vatican. Imagine the contrast if Tom was still alive to take pride in the success of his son, against Michael's quiet resign. Or perhaps the brothers would bond over a shared disappointment, that their children view their life's work as a sin, to be abandoned or atoned for. How might Tom have felt about Fredo? One of Part 3's best scenes comes after Michael's confession, where Connie comforts Michael by talking about how Fredo drowned.
It was a terrible accident. But it's finished.
It's clear from Talia Shire's performance and the context of this conversation that Connie knows what really happened to her brother, but she's chosen to believe something else to make peace with the past. And boy does that detail give a ton of insight into Connie's character. How powerful might a similar scene between Tom and Michael have been, especially since Part 2 leaves the pair on rocky terms?
Why do you hurt me, Michael?
They are still allies, but the foundation has been shaken. Tom disturbed by Michael's cold-blooded campaign of vengeance against his enemies, and Michael treating Tom with hostility and paranoia. The fragility of that relationship, one of Michael's last links to a Corleone family that has so fully degraded, is such a rich source of drama that Part 3 just abandons. And even if Coppola never intended on following up the seeds of potential conflict planted in Part 2, on a very basic level, the defining element of the Godfather saga is the rise and fall of the Corleone family. For the final film to simply write out one of the few remaining Corleone children is a profound waste. To give some perspective, imagine if, in The Return of the King, you found out that Gandalf died at some point after Two Towers, but the Fellowship has enlisted a new wizard, named BJ, who doesn't have any relationship to the rest of the characters, but occasionally does magic when the plot calls for it. Sounds like rubbish, doesn't it? But what was Coppola to do? If Paramount isn't going to pay Robert Duvall what he's worth, what's the solution? Recasting is out of the question given the indelible mark Duvall left on the character, and the Corleone family need a lawyer. So, either you write a new character, or you don't make the movie. And not making the movie isn't really an option given Coppola was broke and needed the money. Compromise was inevitable, and while that's understandable in the chaotic world of filmmaking, it's too bad that it had to happen on something as precious as a Godfather sequel.
I tried. I tried.
Long before he retitled it The Godfather Coda, Francis Ford Coppola has maintained that the third movie was less the end of a trilogy than it was an epilogue to the dyad that was Godfathers 1 and 2. I want to push back on this position, though. Coppola's intent may well have been a coda to summarize the themes of the story and tie up remaining loose ends. But the film he actually made was a grand gangster epic, very much in the tradition of its predecessors. From the first act party, which introduces the ensemble cast, to the climactic cross-cutting where Michael's enemies are assassinated, the film follows the traditional Godfather structure. Donald Tabello is essentially Hyman Roth 2.0, an aging gangster who feigns friendship while secretly plotting to stab Michael in the back. Aesthetically, too, The Godfather Part III maintains Gordon Willis's rich, shadow-heavy cinematography, while much of Nino Rota's music from the first two movies has been recycled. Coppola has said that he related to Michael in Part 3 while making the movie, less interested in the gangster action than he was questions of aging and reconciling with your life. Yet the film is full of intricately staged, violent set pieces, as gruesome as anything from the younger Francis. In some cases, the action is bigger than ever. The helicopter attack is easily the most ludicrously large-scale action scene this series has ever seen. The extended opera set piece is essentially an even more ambitious evolution of the baptism of fire from the first Godfather movie. The audience expected to keep track not only of Michael's enemies being wiped out across a vast geographical distance, but also to the assassin hunting Michael in the theater's halls, and the story of the opera itself. And while the baptism of fire only takes up a little over 5 minutes of The Godfather's screen time, the opera lasts about 20 minutes and is the crux of Part 3's final act. Coda does mitigate the grand weight of being a Godfather sequel slightly, by shaving 13 minutes off the runtime, making for by far the shortest film in the series, and by cutting material with Don Altabello, shifting focus away from Michael fighting a villain, and more towards Michael reflecting on his own legacy. But in other ways, The Death of Michael Corleone feels even more like a Godfather sequel. Much as I love the change in introduction, opening with Gilday discussing the Vatican Bank's woes stresses yet more parallels to Godfather 1, both films now beginning with a desperate man pleading the Godfather for help. Coppola didn't make an epilogue to The Godfather. He made another Godfather, and that vastness of scope in story and style contributes to the hollowness of the ending. That the film proceeds in such grand fashion subconsciously stirs expectations of some sort of evolution or change for its central figure. This has to be going somewhere. When Coda then leaves Michael in basically the exact same place The Godfather 2 did, it's frustrating, as if we've essentially wasted our time. And yet, the very same classic Godfather elements that conjure unrealistic expectations that Part 3 is another epic sequel are also largely executed with aplomb. The look and sound of the Godfather world is as intoxicating as ever. The elaborate set pieces that Coppola supposedly had little interest in are ferociously exciting. The culminating images of Michael's murdered enemies are harrowing evocations of death. As a sequel, many aspects of The Godfather Part 3 are good, even great, but the movie amounts to less than the sum of its parts, because it's a movie at odds with itself. It wants to be a quieter examination of Michael and the legacy he's left behind, but it still bears the expectations of a proper epic, and the resulting film is a living contradiction.
You hate me. You hate me.
Is Coda the Rosetta Stone that allowed me to stop worrying and love The Godfather Part 3? Not really. Though Coppola's changes do largely benefit the movie, the film is inevitably still torn by the intent to make a minor key epilogue and the demands of crafting another grand Godfather epic. Conflicting goals that no version of Godfather 3 is really able to reconcile. That, and I don't think I'll ever be able to get over Tom Hagen's absence. Coupled with Michael's lack of growth, the film can't help but feel incomplete. But upon reflection, while I may not love The Godfather Part 3, I certainly enjoyed the movie a lot more than I used to. Freed from the expectation that the film conclude the Godfather saga, I was more able to appreciate the individual pieces that make up the movie. I especially love how Connie Corleone has emerged as Michael's most trusted advisor, and someone who holds substantial power. Seeing this character grow from the mousy little sister to a leader in the family is incredibly rewarding, and Talia Shire's performance communicates that transformation beautifully. The scenes between Michael and Kay are also rich with dramatic history.
You were all that I loved, valued most in the world. And now I'm losing you. I lost you anyway. You're gone. And it was all for nothing.
And one especially nice detail is how the couple achieve a level of peace with each other, only for Michael to immediately place Kay back outside of his life, looking in. Even more than the overt tragedy of the ending, this perfectly expresses how Michael and Kay can never regain the romance they once had with each other. I also really like the new characters for the most part, especially Vincent. Auntie Garcia really does feel like Sonny's kid, and the setup of the ear-biting in Michael's office leads to a genuinely hilarious payoff. And of course, there's Michael himself. Even if Part 3 fails to really give the character a substantive story, there is still power in watching Michael's final, desperate climb for salvation. Pacino is haunting as a man who has outsmarted, outlasted, and bested every obstacle placed in his way, only to emerge at the other end, wounded and frail. His confession is as elegantly staged and beautifully acted as the best scenes of the series. History will likely always render The Godfather Part III a modest disappointment, but if Coda accomplishes anything, it's a reminder that within that disappointment, there also lay streaks of brilliance. Thank you to Mubi for sponsoring this video. Mubi is a curated streaming service where you can watch some of the most beautiful and incredible works of cinema from around the world. Every day, Mubi premieres a new film. From iconic directors to emerging auteurs, there's always something new to discover. And these movies don't come from a faceless algorithm, but are hand-picked by actual human beings. It's like your own personal film festival, streaming anytime, anywhere. Longtime Eyebrow Cinema viewers might remember a video guide I made about how to get into silent movies, in which I recommended starting with comedies. Well, the good people of Mubi are currently showing one of the very best, Buster Keaton's The General, a masterpiece of physical comedy that's also incredibly suspenseful and exhilarating as a spectacle. If you're looking for an entry point into silent cinema, this would be a great start. And if you're already familiar with the comedic stylings of Buster Keaton, you should watch The General again anyway, because it rules. And the best part, you can watch it and a whole host of amazing cinema for free right now. Just head to Mubi.com/eyebrowcinema for a free 30 days. That's a whole month of great cinema for free.